Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for November 19th. I'm going to be preaching from the gospel reading for today, which is Jesus' parable of the talents in Matthew 25. That is Jesus' story about a master who goes away on a long journey and he leaves three of his servants in charge of his wealth in the form of a measure of weight called a talent of silver. It was an enormous amount of wealth to have a talent of silver. From that word, actually, we get the English word talents, which applies to a special ability that you have, but it comes from this parable where originally it was a unit of wealth, the idea being that we are responsible to God for what we do with all of our talents, not just our wealth, but whatever skill or ability God gives us or opportunity God gives us. So, what does that have to do with our other readings for the day, or what do they have to do with that? Well, our Old Testament reading is from the prophet Zephaniah, one of the latest of the prophets, and he warns the people of Israel that that the day of the Lord is coming. And similar to the Old Testament reading we had last week, it warns that while people might say, "Oh, God is really going to vindicate me when He comes," in fact, the prophets warned that many people are going to experience that as a day of darkness. So Zephaniah has a unique take on this. He calls on the people to be silent before the Lord. That is, be reverent, be sober, be solemn in anticipation of the Lord coming and bringing justice. And he says an interesting thing. He says the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. That's interesting because generally people prepare a sacrifice for the Lord. Excuse me a minute. That is usually think of sacrifice as something we do for God, but God is going to prepare a sacrifice when he comes, and this is a theme in Zephaniah actually, and so he has consecrated those he has invited. Well, who has he invited? He's invited all people, but the only people who are going to respond are those who have been set aside, that is, whose hearts are ready to receive this sacrifice of the Lord. And we as Christians, of course, see this sacrifice of God as the sacrifice of his son in Jesus. And those who were receptive were not the religious leaders necessarily, not the wealthy, the powerful. They were the poor and the needy, and those who were seeking God were receptive. So this in Zephaniah moves on to a warning how, throughout Jerusalem, the capital city, the center of the religious establishment, this is going to produce weeping and wailing when the day of the Lord comes. And it's going to be for those who are apathetic. And it really leads us to focus on consumerism because it talks about wealthy people. And there are a lot of people that argue that in our culture, consumerism is the leading competitor of Christianity. It's not false religions, it's not some cult. It's the fact that we as a culture are totally wrapped up in consuming things, in growing wealthy and buying whatever we feel is needed that's going to make us more significant. And of course, we're coming towards Black Friday, and we will get to see that worship of consumerism, in full throttle as the sales hit us, and start to be advertised even before Thanksgiving Day is over, and people can't gather on Thanksgiving Day because they're too busy getting ready to saturate themselves with food. I mean, it's just so indicative of our culture that the government gives us a day off to give thanks to God, and we're too busy consuming in order to do that. And we even give ourselves a second day to buy more things to consume. So, this warning is really relevant to us as American Christians as it was to Israelite Jews. And, and it's a warning that the day will be a day of wrath and to beware. So, that's a downer, especially because it does apply to us. Our second reading is a psalm originally written by Moses. And this too, is a sobering psalm. It starts out great, Lord, you've been our dwelling place through all generations, which is true because God is eternal. So if you want to have a measure of immortality, you have to dwell with God. And it goes on actually and talks about how short our lives are, not only in the perspective of God, for whom his day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years like a day, but for us too. Our lives, the further they go on, the faster they seem to dissipate. And it uses this great image that's used elsewhere in the Old Testament too, and the New Testament, which is the morning grass that springs up. You might think of a really hot July or August day, and the grass is growing up, but it doesn't have deep roots and it's dry. And by the end of the day, it's just scorched and dying. It might not even be the grass. I've seen plants in my own garden do that when I failed to water them. And this is the story of our lives. But then it turns to us being consumed actually by God's anger, that the beating of the sun is like God's anger, not for specific things we've done, but sometimes for the things that we don't do, haven't done. And Moses says an interesting thing. He says that the span of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. Of course, that's still the average life expectancy. It's starting to go down a little bit in our time. But this is Moses writing it, who started his ministry when he was 80, lived to be 120. He was the exception, but he was still very aware of his mortality as a result of everything he went through. And that there was suffering, that we suffer all of our days. We live under God's wrath. Wrath not being God's momentary anger like our anger, but just simply the natural consequences of our sin, might be a way to put it. That God has no choice but to punish our sin with its consequences, because he couldn't be a God of justice without that. So Moses says this great line: your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. That is, if we were completely fearful, awestruck, respectful of God, we would recognize that his wrath is only just. And that it ends with, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The only way to have wisdom is to recognize that we are not entitled to a long lifespan, that every day is a gift from God. So that leads into our epistle reading, which is taken from the end of 1 Thessalonians. We've been doing a series of readings through 1 Thessalonians. We've reached chapter 5. Paul says, now, brothers, about the times and dates, we don't need to write to you. What times and dates? He's talking about Judgment Day. The people in Thessalonica had heard that Jesus would return. They were looking forward to that, but also that would bring the day of the Lord. And he says, you know very well that the day of the Lord's going to come like a thief in the night. So don't be speculating about when. Instead, recognize that people are going to be saying, peace and safety. There's no such thing as global warming. A comet could never reach the earth. We're all fine. Everybody's fine here. Go out and buy more stuff. They're going to continue to say that until the very end. And Paul uses repeatedly this image of a woman going into labor, which is an apt image because it's extremely painful. It can come on a person suddenly, and it doesn't mean that the end is right away. It doesn't mean that that child's going to come in a minute. It could go on for hours. We just don't know when the child is coming. But going into labor does tell us that the child is coming. And the same is true of suffering in this life and the death of loved ones. They are reminders that our life is not infinite, that we can't, we can distract ourselves and we can be deluded, but we can't run or hide from God's judgment. We're going to go to him pretty soon. If not, Jesus is going to come to us. And so Paul says, don't be like those who are asleep, because we're children of the light. We remain watchful for Christ to come. We live with self-control. It still remains true that more crimes are committed at night. People do dumber things generally at night than they do during the day. There are more auto accidents and, despite headlights and so on, people are just for some reason, they have the illusion that in darkness they can get away with stuff. But that's not so, because there's no such thing as darkness to God. And so, Paul concludes that that we should be self-controlled. We should wear righteousness and and like a breastplate, that is the righteousness of Christ, protects our hearts. And the love of God and the love that we show for others protects our hearts. We shouldn't be cynical. And the hope of salvation should be like a helmet. That is, it should protect our thinking, keep us from becoming cynical or despairing in our thinking, but always remain hopeful, always remain watchful, always remain sober in thought, similar to what Moses encouraged us to do in the psalm for the day. And he says, this is because Jesus is coming, whether we're alive or whether we're dead, awake or asleep. He's going to bring us to be with him. And this is the good news. He says, therefore, encourage one another and build each other up with this good news. So that's what our readings are about. That's what our focus is at this time at the end of the church year. We have one more week where we focus on the end of the church year. Between now and then, we have Thanksgiving, which is a nice break, but we remain thankful to God in part because we know that the world is going to come to an end, and because our lives are going to come to an end, we stop and take the time to give thanks to him and to number our days rightly and encourage and build one another up in faith. I hope that encourages you. I hope you have a great discussion. The Lord bless your week.